Postpartum depression, 1 in 7 women, a lot more common than we'd like to think, is this persistent sadness, hopelessness, fatigue, disconnection from baby, or really significant changes in appetite or sleep that persists, right? Everybody gets sad. There's times that it continues for a short period of time, and it can be normal. There's this term called baby blues, which is common in that first couple weeks after birth. There's just this big physical letdown of all that pressure, and some of this stuff can happen in those first couple weeks. But it can really switch from baby blues to postpartum depression if it really persists and is ongoing. Postpartum anxiety is sort of like that, just a little bit lighter. It's this constant worrying, racing thoughts, intrusive fears about baby safety, physical tension, like feeling really tight. Also, sleep disruption is a part of this. This is what Serenity experienced. You are listening to Dadicated Joe, the new dad's guide on the upending and transformational experience of becoming a father. We are dedicated. Hey everyone. May is Maternal Mental Health Awareness Month, which is such an important thing to learn more about. It's not talked about nearly enough, and something that I really think both dads and moms need to talk a lot more about together to help preserve the mental health of our amazing moms as they are stretched to their limits through pregnancy and birth and postpartum experience and child raising. This is something that Serenity struggled with quite a bit. Postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety is really, really common. 1 in 7 women experience postpartum depression, which is the kind of worst aspect of this. Postpartum anxiety and other emotional issues, even more women. And Serenity dealt with this really intensely. She had really bad insomnia. She was worried all the time, grumpy and irritable all the time, which is a little normal in general for being a new mom, but was like extra strong for her and lasted a lot longer. And we had to do a lot of work to overcome that. So it's something that's very important to me, very important, obviously, to a lot of women, a lot of couples, a lot of parents and kids. So in this episode, I want to talk about how a woman's brain changes after birth. What are some of the signs of postpartum anxiety or depression, and exactly what we can do about it, how particularly dads can support moms in dealing with this difficult time. So first of all, woman's body and brain are completely transformed after birth in a way that men, we really can't understand how it's the rewiring that occurs. For men, we have changes we can choose to take on. We can let it transform our identity. Certainly, it takes a very physical toll in those first few months with the sleep challenges and all the work. But, our brain looks the same on a brain scan, right? Like we can choose to embrace it. They're situational, but we can recover fairly quickly. Women's brains look different. How do they look different? The fear center of the brain grows, gets bigger, especially fear related to the baby. So also does the intuitive center, right? So moms are more afraid, but also more magical, right? And I definitely noticed this in Serenity, that being afraid of irrational things like a picture falling off the wall and landing on a baby, right? As if a picture's ever fallen off the wall, right? But that's the kind of thing that goes through their minds because their fear center is big. But also this intuitive center, she could just tell the future. She could know immediately, not just what baby needed, but things in our life, in our business. She could just sense it. This started in pregnancy for us and has continued really on in the postpartum time, and now continues to be a very big source of decision making for us are her intuition, especially when it comes to Della. So they also have this heightened sensitivity, right? They're more emotional, which can present itself as less logical. They're not actually less logical. They're just more emotional. And that combined with all the hormonal changes and the fear and magic going, it creates what often is lovingly called mommy brain, right? Where there's just this sort of brain fog and logical decisions or executive functioning is a little harder to do. Losing sleep can cause this obviously in anybody. And of course, there's lots of sleep lost in those early times after baby's born. And these changes in the brain can last forever. They certainly last months or even years, and are really evolution's way of preparing moms for this permanent role of caregiving for a child for a very long time. So those are brain changes that are happening anyway. So we have to always remember that that's going on, and moms, in addition to adapting to being a mom, are adapting to this new brain they have. And women like my wife that are pride themselves on being very smart and very confident and very capable and very organized and very technical, it can be even harder for them to suddenly have that part of their brain not work as well. And or if they were already, like my wife, prone to anxiety, prone to obsession or perfectionism, right? That can be even worse. So just something to learn about. And so the extreme version of these changes are what's called postpartum depression, PPD, or postpartum anxiety, PPA. So postpartum depression, 1 in 7 women, a lot more common than we'd like to think, is this persistent sadness, hopelessness, fatigue, disconnection from baby, or really significant changes in appetite or sleep that persists, right? Everybody gets sad. There's times that it continues for a short period of time, and it can be normal. There's this term called baby blues, which is common in that first couple weeks after birth. There's just this big physical letdown of all that pressure, and some of this stuff can happen in those first couple of weeks. But it can really switch from baby blues to postpartum depression if it really persists and is ongoing. Postpartum anxiety is sort of like that, just a little bit lighter. It's this constant worrying, racing thoughts, intrusive fears about baby safety, physical tension, like feeling really tight. Also, sleep disruption is a part of this. And so this is what Serenity experienced and what a lot of women experience, and is different than the baby blues if it lasts longer. So there's a lot of stigma about this. Women have a lot of pressure to enjoy being a mom. They're supposed to be so happy. They're supposed to love this perfect little baby they created. They're supposed to be, so giving and loving and just loving being a mom, right? That's the idea that it's just all these beautiful Instagram moments of the perfect mom and the sun shining on her face with the baby. So there's like stigma that it's not like that. They tear their hair out, right? They're stressed out. They're scared. They're worried. They're crying. They're losing sleep. And of course, the loss of sleep is compounding. The more sleep you lose, the more uncomfortable you are. And the brain changes already messed with sleep. Postpartum depression or anxiety disrupts sleep. And then, of course, the baby is actively disrupting sleep, waking up all night long, needing to breastfeed, needing to be fed, needing support in the middle of the night. And so the sleep thing can really get to anybody, and particularly gets to moms. And so what we can do, right? So first of all, something men, I think we could all learn to do better with women, is listen without fixing, right? Learn to validate feelings, not always rushing to solutions, just accepting feelings. I've gotten to be really good at this actually with my daughter, because we learn how to do this with toddlers around. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be angry. It's normal to feel these things. It's okay to cry. To try and learn to do that with your wife, and just all the feelings. It's okay to be scared. I hear you're scared the picture's going to fall off the wall, right? Rather than saying that's completely irrational. The pictures have never fallen off the wall. Here, let me put 2 extra nails in it to fix it for you. That's what I want to do, right? Take your fear away. I think that's my job, to make you feel less afraid. But it's certainly not my job to make her feel more afraid or to cause her to doubt her intuition. So in addition to just naming and relating to the feelings, I can also be very careful not to add to the fear, right? Not to question whether baby is growing right, or question whether something is going to happen, or just be very careful about talking about scary things in the world, scary risks to our daughter, because they're going to just really be exaggerated in her mind. So really avoiding that, and trying to really trust that intuition, like when in doubt, get past the logic center and be like, it maybe doesn't make sense that there's a risk, but I'm going to do what she says and mitigate that anyway. And worst case, she's wrong and there was no risk, but we took extra action. But best case, she was right and we averted something, or we just show that we respect that intuitive center is strong and powerful. I always talk about doing more housework during this time where her main job is being one with that baby. So for in that first, 3 to 4 months after the baby's born, and ongoing after that, trying to do a significant amount of the housework, even if you never did it before, even if after, you'll come back to a more even split, trying to do more of it. The Fair Play system is really great for helping make sure that men are doing their share of the housework so that women aren't burdened by that extra burden of not only they worrying about their baby and their physical recovery, but they're also have to worry about the house. If you ideally did the fair play system before the baby was born, so you have that and you've got that to fall back on and you know which of her cards to take. If you haven't done it yet, then, figure out as soon as you can do it, because it's really a key thing. If you're 2 weeks into baby, you're probably not going to do it. But within 3 or 4 months after baby is here, it'd be great to go ahead and do the fair play system and make sure that the household is distributed evenly in a sustainable way. You can also help organize support from others. It's more work for you to do too. So the First 40 Days book spells out how to create this postpartum support network. I created a spreadsheet of all the different tasks, and anybody who wanted to come visit the baby got assigned a job, and they got to do this to support us. So that's something you as a man can do, learn to ask for help and learn to organize that help, and that really will help her mental health, to know that it's you and other people supporting the household, while also protecting her from people who are wanting something from her or feeling entitled to the baby, or if there's friends or family that are a little high maintenance or bring their own kind of charge, like, keep them away from mom. She doesn't need to be dealing with that while she's already dealing with the new baby. You can, really help with the sleep. Night feedings are a key way you can help with this. Serenity and I, from the very beginning, alternated nights. Now, I went back to work right away because we were running the company and we had just launched our baby food products. So I didn't take very much time all the way off. And then she didn't really come back to work. She came back to work part-time about 5 months in, and then wasn't full-time until at least a year in. But despite that, even though I was working more than her, I still took every other night because her sleep was so important to her recovery and health. And so every other night I would take the baby. I would sleep in a different room with the baby. And when she was breastfeeding, I would bring her to Serenity to feed. And so I'd have to wake her up for that. But at least that's all she had to do was feed. And then she could go back to sleep and I would do the rest, change the diaper, get her back to sleep, so forth. And then once she was old enough to take a bottle and Serenity could pump enough, she could sleep through the night, and I would feed the bottle. And then if she had to wake up to pump, at least that was on her own time. So alternating nights was something we do to this day. Who's in charge of the in middle of the night wake up, or who gets up in the early morning with her? Alternating nights is key for making sure at least one of you gets sleep every other night and your wife gets some uninterrupted sleep. We were super happy to discover that there's such a thing called a night nanny. You can actually pay people to spend the night at your house and get up with the baby all night. And we loved this, especially during some of those sleep regression times, or when we were night potty training. We hired professional help. So if you can afford it, find a night nanny. Best money you'll ever spend. Someone to sleep at your house and be with the baby. You can watch for those signs of postpartum depression or anxiety, right? You might even notice the changes before she does. Like I said, some of it's normal, so let some of it play out. But if you're seeing that persistent sadness, you're seeing that kind of ongoing stress, you might, find a loving way to bring up the idea that this could be postpartum depression or anxiety condition, and that there's a professional way to help that. There's nothing wrong with getting professional help. There are experts. You have hired experts all throughout your birthing practice, your birthing process. You hired somebody for fertility, or you hired had OBGYNs or midwives or doulas or surgeons or anesthesiologists. And now we've got dentists and we've got pediatricians and we've got herbalists and acupuncturists and massage therapists. Why not have a mental health person that talks about your mental health, right? Especially for women, their brains change dealing with this new brain. Nothing wrong with professional help. Kind of normalize offering therapy, helping to find one for her, helping schedule appointments, helping make sure that there's childcare provided so she can give her undivided attention during those appointments. Overall, protect her rest and recovery, right? Sleep, alone time, nourishment. These are survival needs for her. These are not luxuries. So even if you're working full time and she's not, she still needs all this because she is working full time, right? She's working as a mom taking care of the baby, which is, plus the household, more than a full-time job's worth of work. So really doing your best to prioritize these will benefit you, right? Because her postpartum anxiety can often manifest as grumpiness, irritability, criticism, or just general not niceness to you. And I know that happened with me. Serenity was very not nice sometimes, very critical, very judgmental, sometimes very aggressive. And so the more I could give her sleep, give her alone time, it was in my own interest to have her take care of herself, because if mom's not happy, nobody's happy, right? There's that old saying, and it's super true. And if mom's happy, she will give back tenfold, right? She will make everybody super happy. So overall, right, super important issue. Take care of mom's maternal mental health, realizing these major changes to the brain, watching for those signs of postpartum anxiety and depression, which is very real and very common, offering professional help, taking care of the household, protecting her sleep and her alone time as much as you can. And, there's lots of cool hotlines and books and other websites you can use. I'll put in the show notes if you want to learn more about this, or if you really need help for yourself. So hope that helps, and happy Maternal Mental Health Awareness Month. Stay dedicated.